on business to business and basically providing guarantees, but without trying it to signal it to the consumers. But most schemes will also be associated with an eco-label, because half of the point is you want to signal that you are a sustainable producer to the consumer. And it's a nice topic. As Leonardo said, I'm most of all a salmon economist, but I actually wrote or had published my first paper on eco-labeling as long ago as in 2001. That was mostly because Kathy Roham, who was one of my supervisors, or one of the first people to be interested in eco-labeling. And the last 10 years in particular, it has sort of exploded. First with increased interest of eco-labeling for wild fish, and mostly the eco-label of the Marine Stewardship Council, and then for farm fish. Let me also, in the introduction, say that farm fish is much simpler than wild fish, and also confirms much more closely to the theory, because the ASC and other certification bodies for farm fish, they are certifying farms on an individual basis. And that is the same thing that occurs in terrestrial food production. While in fisheries, it is a whole fishery that's being certified. So by definition, independently of how your specific production practices are at your vessel, it is a whole fishery, so it's more kind of a quasi-public good. But that also means that if you are interested in eco-labeling, most of that literature that exists on different eco-labels in agriculture is fairly relevant. And therefore, I will do a sort of long dive that has much to do about eco-labels and certification in general, and just a little bit on aquaculture specifically. Because there is a large literature, while eco-labels for farm fish is fairly recent. And to start then, food is essential, but it is also a potentially highly problematic component. And most of the early issues with general labeling is related to this thing that we expect it to be safe to eat, but there is actually no way we can guarantee it. And the only way we can make it safer is to have different kinds of regulatory requirements and tests that is supposed to ensure consumers that it's safe, but you can't guarantee it. And that's also where kind of food labeling started. Since the 1970s, there has been an increasing focus on where our food is produced. And that largely follows the growth of the environmental movement, which true, started with different kinds of highly polluted industries like chemicals and so on. But remember, Greenpeace was founded in Vancouver to combat the lumber industry, and in particular the practices involving clear cutting. So very early on, the environmental movement made it a priority to combat natural resource using industries because they had a large impact. And of course, you have the seals that are cute, which makes it easy to raise attention. And as I said then, aquaculture certification is really not that much different from really any other type of presentation. Change, please. So eco-labels is not a new way to provide information about a product. The most common one that we are all familiar with is some kind of company brand. And not all, but most companies want you to associate their brand with some positive values. And quite often it is, when it comes to food, things like it's safe, it's good for you, and increasingly then from the 70s, that is also sustainable. But the first label is much, much older. The first label that I know is the US FDA approved. So the Food and Drug Administration was created as early as in 1906. There was a number of scandals in the US back then with respect to food safety and children dying from drinking milk and stuff like that. And basically the FDA was created to provide regulations, testing regimes, and initially it was a voluntary thing for producers to allow them to put on this FDA approved label. Increasingly, of course, it became mandatory. Change. But the environmental concerns with respect to food production is largely, although not only, due to the increased industrialization of the food process. This is not fish, but I love this picture because at first time I saw it, it was just mind-blowing. But it's showing really this, that food production is largely an industrial process. And it's also fascinating how many people think of family farms and have romantic pictures about how food is being processed, while most places, and the US is a good example, there are lots of policy in place to protect the family farmers, but more than 80% of the food production is undertaken in corporate farms that are like mid-sized companies. I visited a farm in Oregon not too long ago, and the farmer, he had 50 people employed year-round. He had 500 people in harvesting season, but that means that he's not really a farmer, he's just a manager. Change. It's not obvious that this is a bad process, because the research and development work that allows more intensive food production is really the main reason for why we have increased food production globally much faster than population growth. It has reduced prices, and not for all, but for many people, this allows a more varied diet than ever before in history. Shift, please. So, Leonardo, I'm going to do the second half of this slide in 5 slides.
Okay.
So this is global food production from 1961, and these data are really slow to be updated, so they only go to 2010. Probably could get them to like 2014 now. But as you can see, it's a little bit of short run variation, but there's a clearly increasing trend in global food production. So globally, on average, the food availability has increased by about 25% over the last 50 years. So yes, there's hunger in this world, but that doesn't have anything to do with whether we have enough food to feed our people. The challenge is, can we make it worthwhile for those who can produce that food to ship it to those who need it? And that's politics, which is something completely different. Change. Seafood production is one of many groups of foods where production has actually increased even faster than the global average. So again, with a few dumps, but there's a clear positive trend, and global per capita seafood production has over the last 50 years more than doubled. Change. This has 2 interesting phases, though. And it's hard to say where the shift changes, but until the 70s, all the increase came by increased landings of wild fish. And it was relatively easy to do because true, some traditional stocks were already overfished, but there were so many species that one didn't utilize, and there were so many species in waters further away that hadn't been utilized. So basically a growth strategy along the extensive margin more than made up for the increased demand. And then when met sort of a limit. And from the late 1980s, global landings from wild fisheries have been basically stable. And all the increase in seafood production is due to a new technology, aquaculture. Shift. But it's important that large quantities from aquaculture production didn't really start to hit the market until the 1990s. And you can see here really well, it's really after 2000 when most of the growth in global aquaculture production has taken place. That's great from a number of perspectives, but a lot of people are also saying this is bad because when are using industrialized technologies to impact aquatic landscapes that until the 1980s were largely left alone by industrial production, and it's creating lots of environmental challenges. Shift, please. But of course, systematic R&D work and new technology can also address most environmental challenges. Again, this is best seen in the terrestrial food production system because that is where we have most knowledge about how the production process is being conducted. And it is interesting that, for instance, the carbon footprint of a gallon of milk produced in the US has been reduced by more than 50% since 1960. While in much less developed economies, like India, which is the largest dairy producer in the world, the same technology is largely being used and the footprint is the same. And it is hard at times to make people who don't work with food realize this. But in general, the most industrialized food production processes are the greenest, because one are measuring what goes on in many more dimensions, one have control in many more dimensions, and most issues that is creating issues with sustainability is also costly. So basically all kinds of pollution is stuff that you're letting out that are resources that are being wasted. And the better control you have with the production process, the less you're going to waste. But on the other hand, there's a challenge, and that is because of this increased productivity that the R&D has led to, then in those intensive food production processes, the footprint of each farm becomes much larger, and one are producing much more food. But that raises this interesting question: is it a good thing that we are producing more food when it's impossible to provide more food without having an environmental footprint? And I don't know the answer to that. But in the debate about aquaculture and sustainability, sort of a new track that has showed up in the literature is really interesting, in the sense that if you go back and read papers on aquaculture and environment, really anything written before 2015, it will tell stories about problems in aquaculture, and if you find them in a high-profile journal like Science or Nature, they're going to make a conclusion that this is a bad industry. But in the last few years, and I have had Gephardt et al. As an example, that's a Nature paper, one have started to compare aquaculture to other types of food production technology. And it shows pretty clearly that if you in your dietary habits are concerned about the environment, eating beef is an environmental crime. Pork is pretty bad too. Chicken is by far the best one of the terrestrial meats, and the worst fish species are approximately as good as chicken, and if anything, better. And wild fish is, of course, the best, but the supply there is unfortunately limited. Change, please. So basically, we have that the use of the scientific method has increased productivity and reduced environmental impact per unit produced for virtually all food products. exactly which part of this knowledge one are using that differs significantly with respect to the governance system and most often the public regulations. But it's also interesting that using this knowledge can be controversial in itself, as it leads to different types of externalities. So you can overuse water or fertilizer. One can use methods that some people find problematic, such as GMOs in food production. And since Jorge started with a few climate change questions, I actually find it fascinating how people of different political persuasions have different perspectives on science and to what extent that they believe in science. In particular, most people who believe that there's human-induced climate change avoid GM foods because they think that they are unsafe. And most people who accept that the government says that GM foods are safe, they don't believe in climate change. So it is a little bit that it's almost politically correlated which part of science you are believing in. But most of us that truly believe in science, we pick and choose a little bit. Shift, please. But with the increased attention on environmental impacts of food production, a significant number of people, mostly in wealthy countries, finds that the governance systems are lacking or not good enough or allows too much stuff that they don't like or even find unacceptable. And that has opened this room where you have private initiatives who in different ways are trying to signal to consumers that some producer hold themselves to a higher standard, so that if you are one of those consumers who are not happy with the regulatory system, you can at least do your part and choose to buy products that are more sustainably produced. And quite rapidly, most of these initiatives also, after having certified them, it provides some kind of eco-label to signal that, yes, this is indeed a product produced at a higher standard. Change, please. But this is also controversial in itself, because in some sense, we actually don't know what sustainability is. We don't know if it's the word is a noun, so that would mean that either you're sustainable or not, or whether it's an adjective, so that you can be more or less sustainable. But we do know that there exist many and really zillions of definitions of sustainability, and different groups of stakeholders may or may not agree with the different ones. There's a paper on global environmental change with Osmundson et al. That shows that how the different definitions for some of the most important certifiers of salmon is varying. And it is fascinating that how most of them focus on the environmental pillar of sustainability and largely overlook the social and the economic pillars. Increasingly, one have elements of the social pillar, but mostly it is whether the companies follows rules and regulations, sometimes a little bit on what kind of impact factors they are using. But that's more fisheries and aquaculture, whether there's different kinds of servitude or slavery and really bad work conditions involved. And there exist people who think that all the certifiers are basically parasites who want a chunk of the cake because their business is to sell certification and sell eco-labels. And they will, of course, get some evidence in their favor in that they never look at the economic sustainability, because if you're not profitable, there is nothing you can appropriate. Next, please. So what is an eco-label? It is a label on a product that provides a potential buyer with a piece of information about how the product was produced. It's most often provided by some kind of non-profit organization that set up the criteria for certification, and they are at least overseeing the certification process. This is quite often known as third-party certification, as the company's industries being certified, at least supposedly, do not influence the process. But there's definitely big money involved, and that's one of the many reasons why this is important for environmental NGOs and similar organizations. In the US, all the big aquariums are making more money on endorsing sustainable seafood than they are on the tickets receipt of visitors to the aquarium, with, of course, the Monterey Bay Aquarium as being the one that is most invested in the certification business. It should be said, there also exist company or industry eco-labels, but these tend to have little credibility. But again, with some exceptions, like the retail chain Whole Foods, which is strongly profiling themselves for being green and environmentally friendly, and have convinced Americans that, yes, they indeed are. Change, please. So, an eco-label is then basically designed to segment a market as environmentally conscious consumers increase demand for eco-label products, and by not demanding unlabeled products, they reduce the demand for unlabeled products. And therefore, they increase the price of eco-label products relative to the price of unlabeled products. This is meant to give a market incentive for producers to change their production practices to fulfill the requirements set by the eco-label to be able to sell the products at the higher pay to the higher paying consumers or retailers. And it's true. In a number of papers, they will say that a price premium is necessary. It is market access that is the important thing. But if you think about it, that's basically the same thing, in the sense that the only reason it has value to get a label, to get access to a market, is because that market is providing a higher price than the markets that you otherwise would have access to. And as such, whether that premium is a premium relatively to competing products, or whether it's a premium or a higher price to the producer because they can access a better paying market, doesn't really matter. And yeah, a retailer like Whole Foods, we don't know that they pay their producers or suppliers higher prices, but we do know that they charge higher prices. So at least they have the ability to pay them. And in quite a few studies, we do find that high-end retailers, which are the ones who tend to have a higher share of certified products being sold, are charging a low premium for the certification, basically treating it as this is something that we do supply. And some change, like Whole Foods, they wouldn't even allow competing unlabeled products into the shelf. In most cases, price premium is necessary, as the process of obtaining and using eco-label involves money. It's costly to get certified. You pay a small fraction of your price to the certification body when you are selling anything with the label, and quite often the production practices associated with being sustainable is costlier. In some cases, like fisheries, you would actually think that it should be beneficial to be more sustainable. For aquaculture, it's not as obvious if you are on this path of where sustainability is an adjective. And yeah, I have an old colleague in Norway whose father will say, I've produced salmon on this site for more than 50 years. How can you argue that I'm unsustainable? It's not labeled because you don't find it worthwhile, but yes. Next, please. And this is a little bit on this thingy that the Osmundsen paper. There's many environmental impacts that may be important, and they may be important to different consumer groups. So here's water efficiency for different types of animal protein. And as you see, beef is really an outlier. Next, please. And here are nutrient emissions, slightly different selection of species, but again, fish is doing pretty good compared to the big meats, although chicken is here actually better than some seafood species. Next, please. But all these various concerns have led to a myriad of eco-labels. And all of these eco-labels are emphasizing different aspects. And part of that providing an eco-label is also a business, is that most of these, if you meet a representative, will say that, of course, our label are the important one because it's focusing on the important issues. But in some sense, you can argue then that they are catering to different consumer segments that have different preferences with respect to sustainability. But even in fairly narrow segments, specific labels will say something like, you know, yeah, it may be that the Marine Stewardship Council label is fine for wild fish, but the fact that it doesn't include working conditions for the fishers, that means that any conscious consumer needs to know more. And why don't you take my label? Because we actually look at all the criteria that are important that the MSC look at, but we also look at workers' conditions and so on. Shift, please. Organic is actually important here because organic was the first eco-label specifically addressing food, and it was introduced in the early 1980s in quite a few countries. It was introduced by different private organizations with a wide variety of definition of what is organic, going from quite limited, which was basically pesticide-free products, to pretty sweeping prescriptions of how food production should take place, largely without the use of any of the advancements obtained by using the scientific method, in particular, artificial fertilizer. The many different labels and claims resulted, of course, in confusions and infighting among the different providers. And at least in most Western countries, sometime in the late 80s or early 90s, the government stepped in and are now providing a set of criterions for organic labels. In most places, it is a felony to use another label, although they leave this back door open in that, for instance, in the US, if you're an US producer, the only label, or organic label that is legal to use is the USDA organic. But as a retailer, you can import and sell food labeled as organic if it has been accepted as organic by the accepted authority in a different country. That's actually important for fish and salmon because the USDA label doesn't certify any fish. In general, this organization will say that wild fish cannot be certified as organic because by definition it is organic since it is a completely natural production process into the fish get into some gear. And aquaculture is so controversial that most of them don't want to touch it, but Americans can buy organically farmed salmon from Scotland and Norway and Ireland because they are certifying farm fish. Next, please. The first specific seafood eco-label, at least that I'm aware of, are the dolphin-safe tuna in the US that was introduced in the early the 90s. This was also a private initiative, of course, a campaign providing videos and stories of how dolphins were killed, as they were as likely as tuna to bite on the long line. And when the vessel took in the long line, they would kill and dump the dolphins and take the tuna on board. And this created an uproar in the US, and some of the tuna producers realized that, hey, this is a business opportunity. And this organization then provided them with this label. But the uproar was so great that it went to Congress, and Congress created a law saying that you were only allowed to import tuna to the US if it was dolphin safe, which has to do with basically how many dolphins you can kill when you're catching tuna. And true dolphin safe tuna fisheries, in that no dolphin gets killed, doesn't exist. But you can, with specific types of gear, reduce the mortality significantly. But what has happened for the US supply is mostly that, yes, all American tuna fishers have had to adapt new gear, which means that tuna fishing in the US has go way down, since this is much more costly because it's less efficient. Suppliers in waters where there are both lots of tuna and dolphins, like Mexico, they don't supply the US market any longer. There's been a lot of WTO cases because Mexico think that this is a unwarranted infringement on their domestic regulations. But most tuna being supplied to the US today comes from out in the Pacific or the Indian Oceans, in waters where for some reason there are relatively few dolphins compared to the tuna. Next, please. If you look at the literature, then ecolabels appear to work. Probably the strongest evidence, which is indirect, is that there's been a rapid expansion of the number of products carrying an ecolabel, as well as the number of ecolabels. But it should be said that this is largely occurring in a handful of fairly wealthy countries, and that is largely US and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Northern Europe. There is a large literature using survey data that show that people say they are willing to pay more for foods that are produced in a sustainable way, and signal with various ecolabels. When you use retail scanner data, the picture becomes more nuanced. But in most cases, when you estimate hedonic price functions or similar stuff, there appear to be a premium for most products, but it varies. And interesting, it also varies significantly by retailer, where high-priced retailers tends to charge less for the ecolabel, but also have a higher share of the products being sold with an ecolabel. And as I said, aquaculture is a new kid on the block. The Aquaculture Stewardship Council was instituted in 2012, if I remember correctly. And although you before that can find some organically labeled salmon and fish, and there's a friend of the sea label, which doesn't have much credibility, but that was early on to certify both wild and farm fish. And most studies are really recent, and the few studies that you can find until about 2015 is giving consumers a choice to buy a eco-labeled farm product, but without specifying what eco-label it is. And of course, there were no studies using market data. Next, please. So first, this thing that I started to allude to, somewhat surprisingly, there doesn't seem to be a premium in most really high-end stores, which would not be a problem if they don't stack unlabeled product at all. And for some retailers, like Whole Foods, that is the case. But then they become a part of that market segmentation thingy. And for wild fish, Whole Foods actually only do sell MSC labeled fish. For farmed fish, they are less happy with the eco labels, so they do sell ASC labeled fish, but they also are certifying quite a few producers just on their own. We do know that in general, consumers who face very similar products with different prices, they mostly choose the cheaper one, which means that the bigger the premium is for a eco-label product, most likely the market share of that will be much smaller. And there are some hypotheses out there in the literature that discount stores like Lidl in Germany or Walmart in the US will have a high premium, basically because they are carrying a few units, so that if a representative of an NGO or a journalist walks in, they can show that they do carry the eco-label product and they give the consumers the opportunity. But with a very high premium, of course, there's very few consumers that is buying it, which has led to the literature on greenwashing. So basically setting up tools for companies to portray themselves as green, even if they don't care at all. And there's actually parallel literature that is somewhat parallel, which is what they call local washing. Because if you go back first with the organic labels, they were set in not only to get rid of pesticides and some other practices, but also in the belief that they will be beneficial to local farmers. Unfortunately, it proved that even producing organic food was cheaper on large-scale operations. So therefore, you have gotten the more local environment. And again, if you go into Whole Foods, it's actually fascinating how there's a little corner of the produce section that has local stuff. There's a little corner of the seafood counter that has local stuff. There's a little corner of the meat counter that has local stuff. So they carry it, but it's most likely local washing in the sense that it's pretty expensive and it doesn't look like they are selling a lot. Next, please. More serious though, for many eco-labels, it's hard to find evidence that the premium is sent upstream from the retailer to the producer. And that's a problem because if it isn't, the incentives to be greener disappear from the producer. And why this can occur at all, it's like, why? But it turns out that surprisingly often, certification is being paid by a third party. So you have some kind of regional development fund, you have an environmental NGO that is also having a side in promoting sustainable production, who will pay for the production process. And of course, if you're a producer, and if you can use an eco-label and it doesn't really cost you anything, then it becomes a free option. Consumers say it matters, and one of the studies that I've been involved with, which I think is most interesting, is that aquaculture comes at a disadvantage because in most surveys, people will say that they prefer wild fish to farmed fish. So there's a higher willingness to pay for wild fish than farmed fish. But we conducted a survey where we gave consumers the options to choose between farmed and wild fish, and then wild fish labeled with an MSC label and farmed fish labeled with an ASC label. And what that turns out there was that consumers had the same willingness to pay for ASC labeled farmed salmon as they had for MSC labeled wild salmon. They had a higher willingness to pay for wild uncertified salmon than they had for farmed uncertified salmon, but the highest prices was clearly for the two labeled products. So basically the ASC label, at least for these German consumers, would both make up for the challenge that consumers have with farm relatively to wild and with all the sustainability issues, suggesting that at least in Germany, then the higher willingness to pay for wild fish is mostly due because of a perception that they are more sustainable than farm fish. Next, please. For any producer or retailer, which eco-label to carry is definitely a business decision. Here are some of those that you can choose for aquaculture. Wood Olfnes and colleagues showed in a paper published in 2018 that a salmon producer can choose between 48 different eco-labels. True, all of them are not viable in all markets. So in some sense, it may be that this eco-label is useful if you want to ship your fish to Germany, and that label is more effective if you want to ship it to the US. But there's also significant differences between labels. Some have high credibility, they tend to be more expensive. Some are cheaper, and Friends of the Sea is like a swear word among the representatives of the environmental NGOs. They say that they certify based on the FAO's code of conduct, but the nicest thing is that they are really cheap compared to the other labels, because the NGOs at least would argue that their process isn't very sophisticated or doesn't go very deep. And then you have this thing here that the certifiers compete. So even if you are certified by ASC as a company, you're quite likely to get visitors from different certifiers saying, you know, we see that you have that certification, but do you really think that that's good enough? And it is, since you have this close link between the labels and specific NGOs, then you get campaigns where the most famous one is Greenpeace landed on the ceiling of a Asda store in England, and just accidentally BBC and ITV, which is the main TV channels in England, were on site filming where these two parachuters were coming down with a big banner saying Asda is selling unsustainable seafood, and Greenpeace of course provided information and documentation and videos. So you got 5 minutes on the 9 o'clock news with really bad advertisement for Asda. And of course, one of the reasons for retailers to carry eco-labels is that in a setting like that, their communications officer or their environmental officers has no credibility. But if you're actually using ASC label for your fish, instead of sending out your communication officer, you can give a ring to WWF, and it becomes a fight between two environmental NGOs, because the WWF person will show up and say, well, we are that Greenpeace is criticizing the ASC eco-label, but as far as we can see, it is the best label you can have, and as far as we can see, this is a clearly sustainable production process, although it of course have some footprint. Next, please. And that's really an issue, because virtually all the eco-labels are heavily criticized, because the strict environmental NGOs will say that two industry-friendly labels basically prevent sufficiently sustainable production processes, and they will basically say that it's a sellout because they don't promote sustainability to a large enough extent. But on the other hand, if the eco-labels are too strict, there will be very little product available that meet the standards, and an eco-label for a product which consumers cannot buy doesn't make much of an impact. And for the MSC eco-label in the early days, that was a real challenge, in that a lot of retailers committed to sell MSC label fish. But when there was only 2 fisheries, Thames herring and Australian rock lobster, that was certified, and both those fisheries are small, very small, it was basically impossible to get any MSC label fish. And as such, it becomes a kind of a question where if you can provide a label that is promoting somewhat more sustainable production practices at a reasonable cost, you can most likely create real improvement on the ground. One can do better, but if you do, it becomes too costly to do it in a one step. And it's true that the whole family of eco-labels associated with WWF has built in this thing here that they call continuous improvement. So basically they are providing a standard that companies need to reach for to be able to use. But then as a large enough group of companies is meeting that, they're slowly tightening the standards. So this becomes a bit harder all the time. Next, please. So to conclude then, I know I haven't even looked on the clock, so I don't know how much time I spent, but you've been bad at asking questions. So anyway, eco-labels were largely introduced due to mistrust of the government's willingness or ability to address environmental concerns. And that is largely true also for the aquaculture eco-labels. And it's then somewhat paradoxically that the eco-labels that has been taken over by the government, like organic, is the one that seems to work best. The large number of eco-labels available may show both the multitude of environmental challenges facing the food production system, but also the heterogeneity of consumer preferences and the business acumen of the certifiers willing to supply whatever is being demanded. And we know surprisingly little about how big the share of consumers that do care is and how much they care, although we do know that in most countries there's a significant part of the consumers who do not care at all. And as such, there's evidence that eco-labels help some, but not all producers, and in some, but not all markets. Next, please. So do eco-labels improve the sustainability of the food system in general, or for aquaculture in particular? Next, please. And the answer is really that we really don't know, but certainly the profilation of the labels is making the marketplace more complex. It is an attribute that seems to matter in some markets. And again, Whole Foods or Waitrose in the UK is good examples of places which require an eco-label, and you get access to their shelves only if you have it. But is that beneficial to the producer? We really don't know. And just as a last one there, that it doesn't have anything to do with eco-labels, but I was on a project a number of years ago where we interviewed producers of shrimp in Vietnam, and rapidly discovered that there was actually 2 different shrimp industries in Vietnam. One that was targeting the US and European markets, which had processing facilities that was HACCP certified, and one that was targeting neighbors in Southeast Asia that was not. The HACCP was costly, so the price that they obtained by shipping shrimp to the US and Europe was higher. But as you would expect as an economist, there's arbitrage here. So the price difference between what they obtained shipping to the US and Europe relatively to the Asian neighbors was equivalent to the cost of the HACCP certification. And we don't know that, but most likely that is true also for eco-labels.